Well, welcome everyone. We've got a great guest today. We've got Stan Gordon. He's the author of 4 books. I'm familiar with Silent Invasion, the Bigfoot UFO Casebook, a fascinating book. It's one of my favorites on this subject of casebook of Bigfoot UFO Casebook of Pennsylvania sightings from the early 70s. And his most recent book is Creepy Cryptids. And Stan gave a great presentation to our Bigfoot Cryptid Zoom group a couple of weeks ago. And I just wanted to get him back so we could share with you, the YouTube audience, some of the stuff that he's been doing. Stan has been in this longer than I would say almost any of us at this point. So, Stan, welcome today, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Simeon.
Yeah, I was really impressed when we spoke last time that you've been involved in these subjects area since 1959. Is that correct?
That is correct. I started as a 10-year-old child interested in science and electronics and shortwave radio and whatever, and I just happened to hear a radio show one evening talking about strange happenings from flying saucers and ghosts and unusual things, and I was curious. I wanted to know if these people were telling the truth and making the stories up, so I went to our local library here in Greensburg, PA, and began to read all the books, and that's when it all started for me. And I was 16 years old in 1965 when the incident happened near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania.
Right.
I started documenting that case as it broke on the news that day, and I've been out in the field ever since.
Yeah, it occurred to me, Stan, when I heard you talk at the very first UFO crash conference hosted by the Woods in Las Vegas, your talk actually, it was not about Bigfoot UFO connection. It was about Kecksburgs, right? That was the first time I'd ever heard about it.
Yeah, well, I've been involved with it ever since the time it occurred, and it's a long, involved, interesting case. Whatever it was, it fell. And yes. I tracked down hundreds of people over the years who were involved in it, and it's, regardless of what it was, it's a very, very intriguing case.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about it all these years later. That presentation made quite an impression on me. I hadn't heard about it, before that conference, and it's a fascinating case. Did you mention last time that you got involved? There was a group, was it at Westinghouse in Pittsburgh? Of guys interested in this subject? What was it? What was the group that you got invited to of engineers in Pittsburgh? Was it Westinghouse? You said Stan Friedman was one of those people.
Well, actually, what it was a small research group. It was called the UFO Research Institute, and it was a small group of researchers, and included in those were some Westinghouse scientists and engineers. I wasn't a part of Westinghouse. These were just people who were employed there at the time, and they were professionals, and there were other professionals in the group. And it was a volunteer group, and I was the young kid in the group, but I already had a lot of experience interviewing people. I'd been doing it for years before that, so I became their telephone sighting coordinator. So when a call would come in, I would do the initial interviews.
I see. So that's how you got your experience originally. You were the guy that fielded the calls that would come into the group.
Yeah, that's how it was. I was already investigating cases long before that, and then I stayed with them until they shut down our operation in 1969. And I set up a hotline for the public to report UFO sightings. And as the calls were coming into my home, I was overwhelmed, and that's when I set up my first of 3 volunteer research groups of all kind of research specialists that for years would investigate phenomena across Pennsylvania.
Right. And the calls have never stopped, I gather.
That is correct. It is amazing. My phone has been ringing literally since 1969 all the time. It's been ringing a lot in the last few weeks. And between that and email reports now, it's like I deal with these cases almost every day of current and past cases.
That's incredible. Since 1969, I was only 6 years old then. To imagine you've been studying this the entire time since I was 6. I mean, to me, that's amazing, Stan, and continuously. Because I'll just tell you why. We don't often hear about this, as all of our audience knows, in ordinary media sources, right? And we've heard about you recently and those who've read your books. And I recommend that everyone read your books. They're really kind of unique in a unique angle on capturing the intersection of these phenomena. But I mean, it's just amazing. This has just been going on and on. We hear about waves, but for you, does it come in waves, these calls, or do they come in all the time?
Well, they come in all year round.
Yeah.
Under all type of weather conditions, anytime, day or night.
Yeah.
Something you might find of interest in me, and I may have told you this, in going on 64 years of research, I have never personally seen a Bigfoot or a UFO myself.
Yeah.
I've interviewed thousands of witnesses. I've seen a lot of evidence. But anyhow, of course, we had that major wave in 1973, which was the biggest UFO and Bigfoot outbreak in history anywhere here in Pennsylvania. Right. And it was very lucky that I had my first research group pretty well set up, because by 1973, we were covering the state of Pennsylvania. And the group was unique in that we had scientists and engineers and police officers and former military specialists, and we all volunteered this around our full-time jobs to investigate cases, and we were just jammed. So we were lucky we were set up. And then in the summer of 73 is when we had that massive Bigfoot outbreak, and that's when, as all the investigations are going on, and my opinion at the time about Bigfoot was, because I had been investigating Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania since the 1960s, I was of the opinion it was some type of unknown primate, until all these unusual incidents start coming in 1973 from widespread areas. And, of course, there were no cell phones. There was no Internet like today. People had no way of knowing what other people were reporting. A lot of the calls were initially coming into the police departments, and they were often referring the cases to my group to investigate. And that's when we had those very interesting cases with UFOs and Bigfoot seen together. And we began to realize we're dealing with something much stranger. And ever since then, these cases continue to occur. I've learned more and more about the phenomena about Bigfoot, and a lot of strange aspects of Bigfoot that a lot of people don't know about or refuse to want to discuss. But now it's going on more and more all over the country. And I wrote about this back in the 70s, and now all over the country you're hearing similar reports coming in from many areas.
Yeah, now that's a really important point, Stan, because we still hear from many researchers that this is just some rare primate. And I mean, this is something I started hearing in the 90s, and I think I probably believed it for a while. But your experience, even going back to the early 70s, showed you that there was just more going on, that this did not fit the profile of an escaped gorilla or a primate of any sort, even a rare one, a rare sort of primate from prehistory. Just didn't fit that pattern.
Well, a lot of things showed up. It just didn't make any sense. First of all, and something that's ongoing. I mean, even in recent weeks and months in Pennsylvania, and I know this goes on other areas too, is that many of the Bigfoot sightings we receive here are not nocturnal reports at a distance away. Many are very close range in daylight. So we have multitudes. I mean, I've interviewed hundreds of people myself who have seen these things, including a number of them in recent weeks. But one of the first things that really caught our attention is, back in 73, as all these reports are coming in, we would be on the scene sometimes within minutes or hours after they occurred. So this is all year round, including in the snow. And we get out to some of these locations, there'd be trails of these large, unusual footprints with large strides between them, even in snow, that would go a distance and then just abruptly stop when there should have been more traffic. And there was no way you could have fabricated that. That's continued to occur for years in Pennsylvania, and all over the country we're getting the same report. So that was the one thing. But then a lot of things showed up with Bigfoot and UFOs, and one case was really interesting, was in September of 73, north of Pittsburgh. We had two witnesses out in the country waiting for a friend to pick them up when they see the 7-8 foot tall Bigfoot with white hair running across the road toward the woods, but in one of its hands it's carrying a glowing ball of light. And a short time later, this object came across the sky and projected a beam of light down into the woods where the creature ran into. That's just an example of some of the cases we had.
Yeah, you have a lot of cases like that in Silent Invasion. And, reading it recently, you're just struck by how you have all these luminous phenomena around the Bigfoot, it's almost really hard to make sense of it, right? I can't, at least, what the connection is between these UFOs and Bigfoot. And I think part of it is our own bias, where we're still thinking this is because this is what people say to me, Stan. Why would something primitive like an ancient primate have anything to do with something that's really advanced, like an extraterrestrial civilization visiting the Earth? But I think if we stop thinking about it as just a primate and some sort of other entity that has a lot of capabilities that we barely understand, you can start to see that they could operate in the same frequency, same wavelength, something like that.
Whatever we're dealing with, Simeon, is so beyond our understanding, so beyond our present scientific research, nobody can understand it. While I see similarities and patterns to it, a lot of it makes absolutely no sense why it's going on. The whole thing. And again, I talked to other researchers, I talked to so many witnesses, and nobody can figure out what these things are. And it's not just a Bigfoot phenomenon. I found similarities with other cryptids and out-of-place animals, such as Black Panther sightings here in Pennsylvania, that have some similarities to some of the very strange reports we're hearing from witnesses with Bigfoot. Again, many reports come in, including one just a few days ago, where people were seeing what appeared to be a large, solid, huge, hair-covered creature. But some of them are smaller. Some around 4 to 5 feet tall. Most of them in Pennsylvania around 6 to 9 feet tall. And in most cases, they look like solid creatures. But we have other instances where people just can't believe what they saw. That they tell me they're riding down the road when suddenly this huge creature suddenly appears in front of their vehicle. It walks in front of their vehicle. They see it from head to toe, and it's gone. Yeah. And then we have other cases where sometimes part of the body is in focus, other times it is not. Or you can see through parts of the body. These are the kind of things you rarely ever hear about. Again, not just the weird footprints, but electromagnetic effects. Back in the 50s and 60s, you used to hear a lot of low-level UFO reports where these objects would hover over vehicles, and sometimes they're near vehicles, and the headlights would dim, the motor would start to sputter, and when the object took off, the power came back, and the headlights got brighter. We have similar case with Bigfoot, which is very rarely ever discussed. It's been reported across the country, but it's very rarely discussed. But we have incidents where a Bigfoot walked out near a vehicle. When it was close by, the engine began to sputter, the creature walked off, and the power came back on. That's just an example of some of the phenomena I'm dealing with all the time.
Yes. Yeah. So just before we get to some of these recent cases, which I'm sure I'd love to hear about, and sure our YouTube audience would love to hear about, this idea of the tracks ending on the Bigfoot, like in the middle of snow, as Jonathan Dover, the Navajo tracker from Arizona, said, he said the tracks disappear in trackable ground, in muddy ground. It should continue. He said it was like something lifted them up into the sky. They just vanish. When did you first, so we've heard about that recently from people like Jonathan Dover and there are other, when was the first time you encountered that?
That would be in the early 1970s, in 73, during that major wave, when we were getting so many reports coming in. And I remember one case in particular, as I've said many times on interviews, so many of the witnesses, whether it's a Bigfoot or a close-range UFO or cryptid, so many of the witnesses would never have been convinced that these creatures were real or these objects were real till they had their own personal experience. Yeah. And when some of these people have had, were within feet of these creatures, a lot of experienced hunters and outdoorsmen I've interviewed, police officers have reported them, they never could have been, they never would have believed it till they saw it. They could never have been convinced from other people's reports. And people's lives have been changed for years over these type of cases. And there was one fellow, I don't normally use names, but this man gave me permission. He was a witness. He's passed away. But actually, after it happened, he went on TV and radio in 73 because this guy was a complete non-believer. He was laughing at Bigfoot the night before it happened. This was September 3rd, 1973, near Whitney outside of Latrobe, PA, where there have been many reports right on the edge of the Chestnut Ridge. And that night, he and his neighbors were out there on the porch talking about Bigfoot. Had been in the news. They were making fun of it, and he was yelling, "Come on, Bigfoot, I want to see you." Well, little did he know that around, I believe it was around 4 o'clock that morning, he heard this big bang on his mobile home. And he has a garage back there. He had a old antique car. He thought somebody was breaking into the garage. He looks out the window, which goes right to the patio, and standing basically a foot away from him on the opposite side of the window, looking away from him towards the neighbor's home, is this 8 to 9 foot tall, huge creature. And poor Chester was a retired coal miner. He had emphysema. He could barely breathe. After he saw it, he went over, woke his wife up and said, "That thing they call Bigfoot, it's on our patio." She goes over, "Oh, my God, oh, my God." So they make their way over to the telephone, which was the good old days when he had an operator and a dial tone, and he dialed O for operator for emergency to connect him to the state police. And he said, "That thing they call Bigfoot, it's here at my trailer." And within half an hour, they had 6 troopers there. The state police called me, scene to come out, and there were tracks in the snow that he had just mowed earlier, and went across the porch and went down over the road. But at a certain section there, it's just like the tracks just abruptly ended. And he said to me, he said, "Where did the track go? Could these things fly?" And I always remember him saying that.
Yeah, can these things fly? That is something. So here's the thing: is even though this evidence exists from, and you're saying from the early 70s, it takes a while for it to sink in for the rest of us. That this is a reality, because I've often found it's very easy to hear accounts like this, and because it's so difficult for your brain to make sense of it, it's so strange. You can either forget about it, you can't fit it into the other categories you have of how these phenomena can. It takes a while for us to adapt to the reality of what this is. I'll give you one example. I think this is from Silent Invasion. Didn't you mention a case there of a guy that saw a cat in his garage, and every time he went back, it was bigger and bigger?
No, actually, I mentioned that to you. That was not in that book. Actually, it's in my...
Oh, you just mentioned it. You mentioned it.
Astonishing Encounters book. Yeah, but anyhow, I remember it well. So here's the interesting thing. Like I said, this is so complex, we could talk for hours about this and never even get started. But, for example, I've learned a long time ago that a witness can be at the right place at the right time to have an encounter with a cryptid or a UFO. But there are certain specific locations, similar to what you call the Skinwalker Ranch. So I was dealing with Skinwalker-like activity in the 70s here. And you didn't hear about these kind of things till many years later when you heard a lot about the Skinwalker Ranch. Now they're going on all over the country. But here in Pennsylvania, the phenomena seems to focus on certain particular properties for whatever reason. And some of these places have a long history of phenomena going on. So you're talking about paranormal phenomena, so ghostly apparitions, Bigfoot sightings, cryptids, out-of-place animals like Black Panther sightings, these small orbs of light, balls of light below the ground, which I think right now is really interesting, the cases that are going on. UFO sightings, it goes on and on and on. And these places are amazing. I mean, there's one area right now that's for the last couple of years, again, it's in Fayette County, among others, that it's kind of the new one, the Pennsylvania Bigfoot Society, they call it the local Area X. And there's been some amazing incidents up there, and some of these Bigfoot researchers are very experienced, and they know me well. And I told them years ago about the incidents with these spheres of light being commonly reported in areas of Bigfoot activity. And again, it's not just in PA, it's around the country we're getting these reports, but a lot in PA. And they were up in this Area X where there had been a lot of Bigfoot activity, and they were investigating Bigfoot. But about a year ago, when there was a pretty good group of researchers up there, and during that evening, a number of these small balls of light came out of the woods, came within feet of them. And I can tell you, some of these people were very, very shaken. And now they know there's such a thing exists. And so whatever's going on is going on more and more. And if you asked me a question, I think I got off the trail and I forgot what you asked me.
No, it was just, we were just talking about the strangeness of this. And you had mentioned that case about the cat where the guy thought it was a lost cat. He goes back into the garage and it's grown. And then he goes back in and it's like, it becomes one of these Black Panther. I mean, he sees it in front of his eyes growing. It does.
So here's where I was going with this. So sometimes when you have an outbreak of Bigfoot activity in a certain area, you also get reports of other cryptids, including sometimes you get an outbreak of Black Panther sightings. So the incident you're talking about was one of the cases that convinced me also that we're dealing with something that has a physical and a non-physical component to it. That's why we have no bodies.
Yeah.
Anyhow, I'll tell you the story. So this is February 1983, way up in the mountains of western Pennsylvania. It's February. It's cold. This fella comes home. It's around 1 o'clock in the morning. His car's overheating. He pulls his vehicle into the driveway, goes in and gets a can of antifreeze. He comes out. He's starting putting antifreeze in the car. While he's doing that, he hears this loud growl behind him, and he looks, and there's this large black house cat sitting there growling at him. Well, he didn't get too excited over it because out there in the country, there's a lot of cats running around. So he goes back to putting more antifreeze in. A couple minutes later, he hears even a louder growl, and he turns around, and he's pretty shaken because that big house cat has now physically grown to twice its size. So he throws that antifreeze can at it, and the thing growls really loud at him, turns around, starts walking out the door, down the driveway outside where it's well lit. So he runs into his house to find his pistol, and when he comes back out a few minutes later, this big cat is outside, but now he can't believe what he's seeing because that big house cat is now doubled its size. Now he said it looks like an animal he saw in the zoo. It was the size of what he called a black panther, which had been a black jaguar or a black leopard, long tail, glowing yellow eyes, growling at him. He takes a shot at it. He didn't know if he hit it, but moments later, it physically vanished in front of him.
Vanishes. Yeah. And you had cases in Silent Invasion where people shot at the creatures on the porch and stuff, and it would, right, am I correct, literally vanish in front of their eyes as they shot at it?
Well, actually, it was a case in there that it's in a lot of more detail, of course, when we have time to go today. But I'll remember it very well. It was February 6, 1974. It was way up in the mountains of Fayette County where we get a lot of history of activity, including a Bigfoot sighting up there just this past Monday. And anyhow, it was a time period some of your listeners will remember because it was a big national truckers strike. There was gas rationing going on around the country. There was violence on the highway. So in Pennsylvania, the state police and National Guard were doing patrols together. There were members of both units that responded to this incident. I couldn't get gas the next morning to get up there. But anyhow, the short part of the story is the woman was in her little cabin home deep in the mountains watching TV as a normal night. She hears this commotion on her front porch. She had some empty soda cans out there, and someone was knocking the soda cans around. Well, 2-3 weeks before, she had a pack of wild dogs coming through, and she thought, I bet those dogs are back. So I'll just grab my 16-gauge double-barrel shotgun, and I'll just load a chamber of the gun, and I'll fire over their head, and I'll scare the dogs away, which she proceeds to do. She loads one chamber with her 16-gauge shotgun. She starts walking up to the front door. She walks to the front door, turns on the switch for the outside light. She steps out, but there's no dogs. But 6 feet in front of her is a 7-foot-tall, hair-covered Bigfoot that put its arm straight up over its head as soon as she turned on the light. And how does she react? She pulls the trigger and fires right into it. She said there's this bright flash of light, like the strobe on a camera, and it vanishes in front of her. But then her in-laws heard a gunshot 100 feet away, and they called her and asked what she's shooting at. She tried to explain to him. So the son-in-law grabs his sidearm, starts walking down that dark road, and apparently at some point he ran to what he described as 4 or 5 hairy people with eyes like coals of fire. And then there's this large luminous object hovering over the trees about the same time. Wow. That's when they called the state police for help. And I talked to the primary investigator, and he said by the time they found the place, everything was over. But he said the witnesses were very credible. They were positively very frightened. They gave detailed accounts. But he said what convinced him was the animal reactions. They had different animals on the farm, but they had several big dogs. And when they arrived, the dogs wouldn't make a sound. They would not bark. They wouldn't move. That is very, very common with close Bigfoot sightings, and in fact, sometimes with UFO reports, but a lot with Bigfoot sightings. Very commonly, there's animal reaction, and even the most vicious dogs, commonly, when they're close to these creatures, they will not bark, they'll cower, they shake, they'll sometimes lay there and they'll move their eyes around, but that's very typical.
Yeah, and there are cases where the animals even act strangely when the owners come home after a sighting, as if the animals can sense something that the owners encountered, even when they're in their car. You know, there's a case like this in northern Idaho that I'm familiar with, near where I went to school, where the woman said she saw one cross the road. It vanished. She just couldn't tell what happened to it. It should have been there. And then her cat's acting really strangely, hides under the bed. So,
yeah. Well, another case was a cell invasion. Again, there's a lot of areas we get reports, but this area out along the Chestnut Ridge mountain range,
yes,
especially here along Westmoreland, Fayette, Indiana County, but here in Westmoreland around Derry Township, for whatever reason, we have almost annual Bigfoot encounters up there, up along those ridges, many in daylight. And there was one case in there I mentioned during that 73 outbreak that a police officer had called me, and he said, this man just came in, just contacted us. He seemed very, very shaken. He seemed very honest, like, why would the guy make the trip? But he said he and his wife were taking a leisurely drive that afternoon in Derry Township. I believe it was around Hillside, if I remember. And he said, we're riding down the road, and suddenly this huge, hairy creature runs out in front of us and onto the front of the road, in the middle of the road. He said, I hit my brakes, but I couldn't stop in time. I ran right into it, and he said, upon impact, it physically vanished and was gone, and there was no damage to his vehicle.
Wow. No damage to the vehicle.
No.
That is really something. Is this case in Silent Invasion, it's just coming to my mind. You mentioned invisibility about 20 minutes ago when we started the interview. Wasn't there a case that you mentioned where parts of the Bigfoot were invisible? It was like banded, like the person could see part of it and then not part of it and then part of it. Is that one of your stories?
Yeah, that happened up around Jamonville, which is a very historical area. It's right on top of the area around up in Chestnut Ridge in Fayette County. It's an area that has a lot of history of Bigfoot sightings, but there's these big stone, how do I explain it? They're not monuments, but they're very large stone structures up there. And during that time was going on, a lot of people would visit up there, and they would see these Bigfoot creatures up around that area. And people would tell us that at times they would see a Bigfoot creature in daylight standing there by one of these large stone, I'll call it a monument type thing, and it would physically vanish and reappear a short distance away. But in some cases, they saw it running off, and they could see through certain parts of the body. They couldn't see the whole physical body; they could see through it at times.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, that's it. Yeah. There are so many other cases like that. Other researchers report the same sort of thing. It's absolutely baffling to them, where they walk through fences and there should have been, the fence should have broke or something, or there should be, traces of them. And there's just, they walk through the wire. So,
there's so much. And again, with these small orbs of light, they're very intriguing reports. There's definitely a connection between it. But it's much more complex than that. And I think what I may have told you previously, and anyhow, I've been aware of these small orbs of light cases, balls of light cases. I've called them mini UFOs for years. I knew about them back in the 1960s. Many people didn't talk about them, but I've talked about them and I've written about them for years and years.
Yeah.
In more recent years, you're hearing more about these all across the country. Just like I said, you're hearing more about them in Bigfoot areas. But also, you're hearing many other cases that are not Bigfoot connected. So these objects, they're generally spherical, but there's other configurations that have been reported, which are odd too. And what's really intriguing is they're not objects in the sky high. They're low to the ground, many at eye level, many very low to the ground, including incidents where they've been on the ground, even in daylight. But what happened last year, we had the biggest surge of these cases ever documented all over the state of Pennsylvania, many in southwest PA. Many of the cases were amazing. If you go to my website, stangordon.info, people can read about some of these. They've continued in recent weeks. Just to give you an example of a couple of the reports, and there's many. And by the way, I've had reports of these things following moving vehicles. I've had them enter people's homes and cars through open windows. I've had them hover right in front of people's living room windows. We've had them report them inside of people's homes. It's very complex. And again, it's all over the country. You hear these kind of reports now coming in. People are talking about them more and more. But in October of last year, for example, this would have been again up in Fayette County. And you can find these reports on my website. So this was October 8th, so not that long ago. It's 6 o'clock in the morning. It's very cold outside. This fella, it's around 40 degrees. The guy decides he's going to go out to get his newspaper. He's in his pajamas and slippers. And he starts walking towards the newspaper box. And it gets about 10, he sees this small white sphere about 10 to 12 inches in diameter hovering right between him and the newspaper box. And he told his wife that he got unusually tired all of a sudden when he was near this thing, and she found him sound asleep on the porch, which he would never do, in the chair, in a freezing cold weather. And he said it's just because he couldn't stay awake because he got so tired being next to this ball of light. So here's what's really intriguing. So that was October the 8th. On October the 11th, 3 days later, up in the Laurel Ridge area, which first you have the Chestnut Ridge, then not far away, you begin going to the Laurel Ridge area, also very active with phenomena and all kind of stuff in cryptids. But anyhow, so this is October 11th. Inside of the home, this woman awakes at 2:30 in the morning to go to the restroom. She comes out of the bathroom. She lives in one of these old homes that have high ceilings. 5 feet away in her living room, she sees this deep blue-colored sphere about 1.5 feet in diameter. Inside of the sphere, she sees this gray swirling mass moving around. She looked like an old lava lamp. And she remembered taking one step towards it. She felt like a slight electrical tingling sensation. And then all of a sudden, she said she became so sleepy and tired, she immediately went to sleep. And she said the next day she was very sluggish and groggy for hours and hours, but she said, I'm an insomniac. I don't fall asleep. I should have been awake for hours. She had no explanation why that would happen. So here's this interesting physiological effect of two people who've been close to these objects and describing the same thing.
Now, that is really fascinating. The sleepy effect. You know, I have to tell you, even amongst researchers of ball lightning, you know, just cut and dried scientists who study ball lightning, they cannot explain some aspects of them, how they interact with people. They seem to, be aware, some of them, of the people and interact in ways that make them seem sentient. And there's a real fine line, wouldn't you agree, in this crossover between some of these orbs that seem like mini UFOs and others that just seem like sort of ordinary ball lightning? It's really quite strange. I think we could agree.
And it's very interesting. And I've been involved with weather phenomena and weather type things for years and years as well. And I can tell you, the cases we're talking about here, which are numerous, we didn't have any bad weather conditions. Most of it was clear weather conditions. There was nothing like that occurring at the time. So I keep an open mind, but I think there's some differences between the two phenomena.
Yeah, that's a whole big subject in itself. That is a fascinating area. Yeah, because some of the researchers call it overlapping phenomenology. In other words, the ball lightning appears like UFOs, and you're familiar with, Hessdalen, Norway, and all of this. And it's really hard to tell the difference. And yet some of them, you're saying, are just clearly not in the ball lightning category. They're moving around. They're doing things that make them more like UFOs than ball lightning. And as you're pointing out, there are some conditions that are favorable to ball lightning, storms and things like that, even though it can appear really anywhere. But some of them really seem sentient, don't they? These little orbs. Do these seem like small UFOs to you? Like just smaller versions of larger craft in the way that they're interacting with people? Okay,
so here's many other reports. These objects about the size of a golf ball or baseball, but many about a foot or two in diameter. That's pretty consistent with many of the reports. Sometimes they look like solid spheres of luminous different colors. Sometimes they're transparent. I have other cases where these things have come with very close people, and they appear to be solid and metallic looking instead. And then there have been instances where these things have been on the ground. And if you go to my website, you can see an amazing sketch from one of the articles I wrote about one of these things was from northern Pennsylvania last year, where the thing was landed on the driveway. And it was more than just a sphere. There was some very strange appendages connected to it.
Right.
But here's another example from November 2019. Up in the wooded area of southwest PA, during the afternoon. The guy's driving down the road, and he's at the top of the hill, and as he's riding towards his house, he has to stop because here on the road is this ball about 2 feet in diameter that was on the road and blocking him from getting to his house. So he's looking at this thing and trying to figure out what the heck this thing was, but he realized, well, I got to go out and move this thing or I can't get home. As soon as he opens up his car door and starts walking towards it, it begins to fade away and vanishes, and it's gone.
That is, and it has a lot of parallels to these cryptids, which can seemingly disappear at will.
Exactly. And also, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just saying, it seems like when people interact with some of these cryptids, they almost like affect the energy field and they like pop like a bubble. That's the feeling I get from some of your descriptions. But there's a whole variety of ways they disappear. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, one thing, here's the pattern I found many years ago, and it's ongoing. Many close-range, low-level UFO sightings. So we're not talking just light sources. We're talking large, solid objects. Many cases of them low-level, and also many instances of encounters with Bigfoot and other cryptids often occur in the vicinity of high-energy sources. So you have many encounters around high-tension power lines, power plants, bodies of water, radio towers, cell phone towers, gas lines, gas wells. It goes on and on and on. I have no doubt that there's an energy connection to whatever we're dealing with.
Yeah, that's a very interesting angle on it. Nuclear power plants, so forth. Yes. Right. That connection to atomic power plants. I mean, it's in many, it's not just in the United States. I mean, I've heard cases of it coming from Canada and other places where they see these Bigfoot Sasquatch creatures around the plants. And I remember you mentioned there's cases like that in Pennsylvania too.
Oh, many. And it's not just nuclear plants. It's all time coal-firing power plants, but it's energy sources. And here's also what... No, go ahead. We keep running over each other with the signal.
No. So it's a very important point what you're saying. It's any energy source. They seem to be connected to it in some way. Yeah, go ahead.
And also, a lot of the UFO reports, and even some of the things you're hearing, some of the military talking about in the last couple of years. Some of these objects, and we're getting lots of reports, by the way, of cigar-shaped objects, cylindrical objects. You know, they seem to like to call them Tic Tacs now, but we've had reports of these for years and years. But I've had reports of these large, solid objects, even in daylight, that slowly begin to fade away and just they're gone. But also many reports in the last, many more reports in daylight, again, of large, solid-looking cigar-shaped objects that people are telling me they're watching them in a beautiful sky, just hovering there, and they just almost instantly just vanish and they're disappearing. They don't see them anymore. In other cases, they're moving so slow across the sky, they're moving much slower than an aircraft. So that's been very, very common even in recent weeks. And a lot of reports of large triangular objects being reported. We had one incident in July of last year down in the Mon Valley outside of Pittsburgh. So it's near the Monongahela River, which that area is just full of stories of everything from Thunderbird sightings, UFO sightings, Bigfoot encounters, weird creatures and things and objects seen over the river and things in the river, all kind of stuff down there. But there's been a lot of phenomena down there. But this case in July, 2 people were crossing Elizabeth Bridge. They see this huge, solid-looking black triangle hovering about 150, 200 feet above the water. It's hovering, but it's pivoting, and it's so wide it's taking up both sides of the river.
Wow, both sides of the river.
Yeah, they said the thing was easily 300 feet long.
And what was the shape of it?
A big black triangle.
Oh, big black triangles. There are the triangles again. Yeah. Wow, it's almost like there's a whole nother reality next to us, and it just pops in and then it's gone again. and you think, it's so, we have these scientific methods that are hundreds of years old that demand some sort of repeatability. And that's really the challenge with this is you, as a researcher, has been involved. You've seen some of the same patterns over and over again. And the witnesses, when you talk to them, they know what they've seen. And yet it can seemingly disappear for a while. it's like it's there, but you can't see it or interact with it. And for a lot of people, they just wonder, where is it? And then it pops in like this. And some of these craft are so huge. They can be as small as you're pointing out, these mini orbs, and then they can be vast. It's really mind-boggling. What were some of the other accounts that you wanted to mention? You're always involved with this recent accounts that you said you've been doing some research on.
Well, there are so many. A lot of the Bigfoot reports are very interesting. Just a few off the top of my head. Let's see. This would have been November last year, up on the Chestnut Ridge. This between Indiana, Westmoreland County. It was early morning. The sun was just coming up. A woman's coming out of her property deep in the woods. She catches something out of the corner of her eye, and she looks, and here's this 8-foot-tall Bigfoot carrying a deer over its shoulder. Mm. It stops. They make eye contact. When it sees her, it allows out a loud grunt, and it just starts walking off through the field into the woods and gone. Mm-hmm. So a lot of reports we're getting are daylight reports, and there have been recent reports, again, of smaller ones. And then the one was just a few days ago. I'll be posting a more detailed report of it on the website. But anyhow, one of my research associates, Jim Brown, who's investigated a lot of incidents up in Fayette County, he went over to the scene to interview and look over the property the next day after he got the report. And briefly what I know is that the guy that evening was in his home, was getting ready to go to sleep, when something was disturbing the cattle on the property. And he looked out and he figured, well, I bet you maybe there's a coyote out there. So he grabs his rifle and he starts walking outside, and there's no coyote, but he sees in the middle of the muddy area where the cattle are that here's this 8-foot-tall, huge, hairy, man-like creature standing there with very long arms. And there's more detail, but that's all I know. He yelled at it, and the thing took off. And the animals are pretty shaken, and after the thing left, they said all the animals' behavior settled down. But there's a little more to it, and I'm waiting for more detail.
Yeah. Okay, so let me ask you this about the Bigfoot, and I'm sure a lot of people wonder this. I wonder it myself. In some of these cases, you hear this from hunters and other people. They see the Bigfoot carrying a deer over their shoulder, chasing deer. Very proficient hunters can, snap their necks very quickly, all types of animals. It makes them seem very physical and very, very evolved people, animals, whatever they actually are. And we also have the cases that you've described so well of where they just vanish in front of your vehicle, just disappear. Do you think this is the same creature or type of human, and it's capable? I mean, it's a very proficient hunter and it's very good at interdimensional skills, or is it two separate species?
Well, no, I don't think anybody has the answers to certain things we're dealing with.
Yeah.
I question, there have been Bigfoot sightings all over the country and around the world for how many years? Thousands of reports, and yet nobody's come up with a body that we can confirm. No. There's just so many aspects of this that is so bizarre. I mean, some of it I'm even reluctant to even talk about, but I know that other researchers around the country and around the world are finding and hearing the same things I am. Some of this stuff is just so incredible. I mean, you hear reports of balls of light changing into creatures and creatures changing into other creatures. You've heard these reports too, okay?
Yeah.
And I, during that wave of 73, as I mentioned, Solid Invasion, that you have a lot of your so-called typical Bigfoot sightings, something, 6 to 9 foot tall, sometimes very muscular. But then you had other reports of creatures that were taller and thinner, and some were smaller and more muscular, more muscularly built. And then, of course, we have the smaller reports, too, which are not that common, but they've become more interesting and more reports in more recent months or so. We're getting more reports of smaller ones, too. But anyhow, and then you have the Dogman reports, okay? And again, some of the cases from 73 where people were literally within a few feet of these creatures looking face-to-face at them, those descriptions were more like what we call Dogman today, because the face looked more like a dog or a wolf. And they talked about the glowing eyes and the fang-like teeth. Yeah. And Now, see, here's an interesting variation, and the story's in Cell Invasion too. So anyhow, here, and this just shows that even the bigger strangeness as a phenomenon. That here's a person, she's visiting friends out here in Westmoreland County, out in the country where there have been a lot of Bigfoot sightings going on for months. It's a very low foundation to the ground. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, she needs to go to the restroom. So she's sitting there directly in front of the screen window. She's hearing these strange animal vocalizations outside, and suddenly this thing rises up from the ground, and she's looking directly in its face from behind its screen. It's behind the screen, looking directly at her, right into her face, face to face. She describes the fang-like teeth, the glowing eyes, the face and the hair, and how it looks more like, again, something like more like a wolf or a dog. She was hysterical. She ran out of there screaming. They called the state police. The state police phone patched her for me to talk to her. They sent a trooper out. They found some 3-toed footprints out there. So here's the even more interesting. So she's so frightened, she wanted those people to take her to her home several miles away. Within the hour, the same or a similar creature showed up at her house, and that's not the only. That's not the only case I have like that.
Yeah, that's right. Shows up at the house later. And this has happened to people that have traveled, they said, on the highway for quite some distance, and it still shows up at their house. So,
and I was going to say, it's not just with Bigfoot. I have other cryptid cases and things like this where similar things have happened. There's other patterns to it. It is so complex. It is so unusual. Yeah, we don't even know where to begin to talk about it. There's so many cases. I noticed this, and I knew this back in actually 1972. I began to notice these patterns and the weird stuff, and it's like, what is going on here? And how do you try to present this to researchers and the public? Yeah. And I tried to do it, and I did do it to the extent that, people, I was in touch with many of the well-known names in the Bigfoot field in the 70s and many witnesses, and I started writing about it. And now, years later, now we're hearing more and more about similar cases going on all over the place.
Yeah, now, you mentioned the big black cats before, and I just passed by Mount Rainier about an hour or two ago because I'm on my way to the Forks Bigfoot Festival. And I happened to, my route took me right next to Mount Rainier. And I was talking to someone who lives in the area about a week or two ago, and they said they have something out there they call ape cats. I said, what's that? Ape cats? Is that another type of Bigfoot? He goes, no, it's a huge cat. It's a huge black cat. So these black cats, big black cats, Panthers, whatever they are throughout the United States, North America.
Yeah. I mean, we're here. This is not something new. It's been going on for years. And people all across the country reporting seeing what they would call black panthers in areas where they aren't known to exist. Right. And, you don't hear about these things in Africa or Asia, not around here. Not here in Pennsylvania, not in the East Coast and other areas. And once again, there's patterns to it. That sometimes when you have an outbreak of one cryptid, you get another outbreak. Or you just get reports of the separate cryptids being seen. And it's just, it's so fascinating. And you can't eliminate, because so many of these witnesses are so credible. They have no reason to make the story up. They're very detailed reports, and they don't even know about the other reports coming in.
Yeah, they don't know about that. And this is the issue we're facing is people don't know that other people have experienced it because we don't talk about this very much in the U.S. in the open. People generally don't share these types of stories. It took me, in some cases, decades, people I knew who had taken my remote viewing classes for them even to tell me their stories because they were still shocked by their stories. They almost didn't want to talk about it until, I said, we have to talk about it. It's very hard to share it because people are afraid of how neighbors and friends are going to react.
And that's exactly what I deal with all the time. That's why you see I don't use people's names without permission. Yeah. I hardly ever use any witness names. And it's amazing. It's sometimes even weeks or months or years later, other people, without knowing it, will confirm some of those reports where they have good data that can support the dates and locations and confirm other people's accounts. But, I've been doing lectures for years and years. I've done a lot of them over the last year already. And everywhere I go, people come up to me and share with me incidents they've had or friends had or neighbors had. And none of these cases have ever been reported. And I'm in touch with many other researchers in the state who are all getting reports. I get many reports. We cannot imagine how much of this is going on and how much we don't hear about. I mean, it's just amazing.
Yeah, so this is the question. What would you say, just generally, the percentage would be of people who've told you their encounter stories who haven't shared it with any other researchers or anyone else? Would you say it's a lot? Yeah, you're the only person told it about.
It's a very, very high percentage.
Very high percentage.
Very high percentage. Yeah, it's just amazing, and people are just amazed. I mean, just the stories I've heard in the last couple of months from places I've been lecturing at, and some of the stories. Now, a lot of people. Some people will share an account there because they're not right from the area, but a lot of people call me confidentially afterwards to discuss it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, if you can see the reaction, the emotional reaction of some of these witnesses, and I mean, before the pandemic hit, and I was doing a lot of out there interviews, and I was doing some outdoor shows and things like that where a lot of hunters were there, and they were coming up to me, sharing with me. And I remember I must have met with 2 or 3 very experienced hunters for years during that time. And I remember sitting there with 1 or 2 of those guys, and they had tears coming out of their eyes because they said, we love the woods, it's our life, and after what we saw and experienced, we'll never go back in the woods again.
Right. Yeah, I can totally understand it. I remember a case from the Bailey Sasquatch Outpost. You might have heard of it or familiar with it. That Jim Myers told us that these hunters, these were hunters from Pennsylvania, from your state, who said they heard something coming at them in the forest. It sounded like a bulldozer. This is all very familiar to anyone who's familiar with these stories. Sounds like a bulldozer coming at you in the forest. They're all armed and they have these, flashlights and lasers on their weapons. And at one point they raise their weapons up just to see what they're looking at. And all they see is a blue mist. That's all it's there is blue mist. Yep. And they said they'd never shared it with them. They'd never told anyone before because it just sounds so strange.
And I hear that very often.
You do.
Sometimes both UAPs and cryptids and Bigfoot look more misty or they're surrounded like a mist or a fog. That's very, I hear that fairly often.
Very common, mist and fog. Yeah. Well, Stan, I would like to talk to you again another time because I ordered your Creepy Cryptids, and as I mentioned to you, it was stolen from my porch. And I didn't get a chance to read it. I wanted to read it in time for this interview, and I had to leave on this trip to go to this festival. They're screening a movie, a new Bigfoot movie, and they interviewed me for a little bit, and they wanted me to be there just to help talk about it and stuff. Flash of Beauty Part 2. And I didn't get a chance to read Creepy Cryptids because someone's going to learn a lot about cryptids because they took it right off the door. You know how Amazon photographs now your door with the package? It was there, and I went back, and it was gone. And none of my neighbors said we didn't hear anything, we didn't see anything. So,
oh my!
Yeah. So anyway,
I was going to say for your listeners in this part of the country in the Ohio area. Next week, I'm speaking at the Big Monster Fest in Canton, Ohio. It's June 3rd is the main day. I'll be talking about all these type of things and the strange aspects of the Bigfoot phenomena, and many well-known researchers from around the country, and others will be there as well, like Lauren Coleman and Cliff from Finding Bigfoot, Lyle Blackburn.
Yeah.
A lot of them will be there, so it's going to be a very good event.
Are you guys going to have a panel discussion or anything like that where you can share? I know Lauren Coleman has his ideas. I mean, he's the one who sort of introduced me to the topic in the 90s. Do you guys actually have a discussion back and forth in front of the audience?
That is going to be, I understand, Friday night with the viewing of a new film that Seth Breedlove is doing with Small Town Monsters. So I am going to be on the panel. That's Friday evening.
So what can you just say for our audience? And I'm going to get this up before then. What is it again? In Canton, Ohio? What's the name of the conference or festival?
You know what? If you go to my website, stangordon.info, look on our upcoming events. It's on there. But it's Small Town Monsters, and it's called the Monster Fest. It's in Canton, Ohio. So
Yes.
it's June 3rd is the main event, but I believe June 2nd is the panel discussion that evening.
Great. Okay, Stan, I wish we could continue for another hour, but I'm on the road at the moment, and it's not the best position for me to stay for more time at the location I'm at by the side of the road.
All right. Well,
but
if
I
your
do.
listeners want,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I'm sorry, we keep going over top of each other. If the listeners want to check for some reports and information, my website is stangordon.info.
Yes.
And my contact information on there, and my books are all available on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com.
Right. So stangordon.info.
Correct.
You sent me that link, and there's so many great cases on there, and you have links to other sites, Pennsylvania Bigfoot Group and so forth. If anyone wants to see the latest cases, this is the great place to go. There's even a picture of that case, Stan, where you mentioned that weird luminosity on someone's driveway that had the most interesting shape to it. And people can see that on your site.
Yeah.
Yes. And Amazon and Barnes and Noble's great. Anyway, Stan, thanks so much for coming on again. And, the way your perspective on this and your entire experience, it just shows us there is a connection between these phenomena. It's not like anyone understands it, but we just have the slightest clues. But it's so fascinating that where you have some of these cryptids, you have others, then you get UFOs, instead of these being separate topics. So thanks for, again, reinforcing that point today.
And thanks so much for having me on. It was an interesting interview. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Thanks again, Stan. We'll talk again soon, okay?
Right. Good evening.
Okay. Yeah, take care. Yep. Bye-bye.